And into that conversation, I want to be able to bring in Debt Rescue's Annaline van der Poel. Thank you very much for your time, Annaline. And I've just painted a very bleak picture of the current state of affairs for the average South African consumer. And maybe you can give us a sense of what you are seeing as Debt Rescue when it comes to that high cost of living onslaught that we've seen, and how consumers are basically navigating that market at the moment.
Good morning, Rafiwa, and thank you so much for having me. Indeed, that was really well illustrated of exactly what consumers have faced in the last 2 years. This was the 8th consecutive interest rate increase that we've seen. And obviously, it might not have been as high as had been predicted. The reality is that short analysis you've shown, that's just the impact in a question of 2 months. It's been devastating on consumers because, for the average consumer who has debt, on the one side of his budget, he has, his normal living expenses. So this would be your food, your rent if you don't have a bond, school fees, interest, insurances, cell phones, your normal expenses. And then on the other side of his budget, he's got his debt repayments, which if he has a bond, the car, credit cards, store cards. So on the expense side, we've seen massive increases because of inflation, obviously. And on the debt side, we've seen the increase in the repayments of debt. So it's really had a very, very negative effect on consumers. Like you said, looking at a basic bond, if you suddenly say that your installments have gone up, for an example, by 2,000 Rand, who has 2,000 Rand extra in their budget to just repay this and then still buffer for the other debt and the living expenses? It's really having a horrible effect on consumer budgets.
It really has, Annaline. And of course, you as Debt Rescue speak about the notion of a national debt disaster. If a trend of this nature continues, what exactly would that look like?
Well, the reality is we are going to continue seeing a large number of defaults. There are so many consumers right now who are hanging on by the last bit that they have. They've cut down, they've done everything they possibly can to try and avoid the possibility of them defaulting on their debt. But the disaster that this could lead to is going to look something potentially like what we had in 2008 when, consumers just cannot anymore. They can't keep up with the cost of living and with the debt costs. And we're going to start seeing, eventually huge defaults on debt and consumers having to, potentially start losing assets if they don't take corrective action or get assistance as quickly as they can.
Are there any interventions, Annaline, that government or related stakeholders, as well as the retailers, that they can put in place to alleviate some of the pressure on consumers, or is everyone going to have to sink or swim?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that could definitely be investigated. We could possibly look at the option, and I know, obviously the government needs every cent it can, but maybe looking at making a couple of more basic items, VAT-free, so that there's a zero VAT on more of our staples, which currently mostly applies to meat and vegetables. Maybe seeing, looking at that's an extra alternative. And probably the most important thing government has got to help us with is stabilize our electricity supply, because the ripple effect of not having electricity is so wide right now. It's everywhere from small businesses, not going to be able to keep open their doors, our farms, the dependency on diesel for them to run their operations, what that does to the product that they are, having to sell again, and it's just very, very broad. So probably the most important thing where we can see some help here is looking at when the fuel price goes down, see what impact that has on the costings, see where they can start reducing the price of goods back in the store when they are seeing the reductions in the fuel prices and the impact on transport. And yeah, definitely we need to stabilize the electricity supply in the country.
Mm-hmm. Annaline, here's something that's quite worrying, and you can perhaps give us the details around that, in that obviously institutional lenders like your banks are becoming a little bit more adverse to lending consumers because of the fear of bad debt that has increased increased over the last few months or so. So you'll find consumers going to other sources of funding that are perhaps not legal or that have insane interest rates that may leave a consumer in more trouble. Are you finding consumers, just based on your engagements and what you see in terms of trends, that consumers are increasingly approaching loan sharks and falling deeper into debt just to get by on their daily expenses?
Indeed. I mean, consumers are at their wits' end, and they're going to take whatever solution might be available to them. So if this includes going to unregistered lenders, they're going to have to, or they see no alternative for them, because when it comes to the end of the day where you need to put food on the table, you need to pay school fees, whatever your necessary expenses are, they are going to turn to whatever options are available to them. And it's a very sad state of affairs, because it's an unregulated industry. There's very little recourse, and the methods applied to, in terms of what they charge and how they recover their fees, and their funds are sometimes very difficult positions that consumers are placed in.
With that then, Annaline, what kind of advice would you give to a consumer who is perhaps defaulting on their debt at the moment and are perhaps using a credit card to get the basic groceries on a weekly basis?
Well, I think if you're sitting with the position of where you are buying your groceries on credit because, for example, you want the rewards, but you are still in a cash flush position, make sure that you repay that credit card immediately. But if it's a case of you are turning to credit because there is just more month than money, and let's be honest, January is the longest month of the year because it's 6 weeks since the previous payday for most people. If you have reached the point where no matter the cuts that you have made, you've made the lifestyle changes, you just cannot afford to put food on the table as well as service your debt, is to seek help from a registered debt counselor. The National Credit Act came out in 2005. Debt counseling came into being in 2007. And when that big economic international, disaster happened where consumers were placed into such a difficult situation, this was a huge lifeline back then already. And it's just proven over the years that this is a sustainable solution for consumers who are struggling with their debt to repay their debt in a more affordable manner, and making sure they retain their assets, they prevent legal action, and most importantly, they cover their living expenses. They can still make sure that they don't have to incur further debt for items that are consumed long before they are paid, for example, food.
Annaline, thank you always for your insights this morning. That is Debt Rescue's Annaline van der Poel joining us from Debt Rescue, talking about those interest rate increases that I've just spoken about and the impact on consumers and the kind of assistance you can get should you find yourself in a financial crisis. Now, I'll be back at the top of the hour with all your headlines. Don't go anywhere, though, because after the break, we've got Week in One.
That was pure luck, Dad.
No, that's what experience looks like. But you've got your license. Give it a go.
Stop!
That's why I'm insured with Auto and General.
For comprehensive vehicle insurance, SMS quote to 40360 today. Auto and General, what experience looks like.